So today we're going to talk about right sizing to maximize saving on AWS. I have here with me Erin. Erin, who are you?
Who am I? So I guess you know that my name's Erin Carlson. The slide also tells you I'm a product marketing manager here at AWS, which I've been doing for the past 3 years. I recently also added UX lead to my repertoire. So if you're going through some of the products on your own, we're always excited to hear your feedback, even during or after this presentation. I also, maybe one or two of you know this, am the voice of the AWS Cost Management blog, and perhaps I'll be talking to some of you more often after today. Really excited to dive in with Arthur. He and I talk all the time about ways that we can make your lives easier when it comes to managing your costs and usage, and so time to get right down to it.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm Arthur. I'm part of the AWS Cloud Economics team. I'm doing this for over 5 years, helping customers only to spend what they need on AWS. Great to be here. Fun fact, you guys can't see me, but I'm using the same shirt on this picture, which maybe it's because I'm very into optimization, right? So let's get into it. So today for the agenda, I'm going to start talking about the right sizing definition, why you should care about it, why organizations should consider to invest time on it. I will talk a little bit about how you can build a consistent approach at your company to tackle this. Erin is going to cover about the tooling perspective, what kind of tools AWS offers today, and we're going to close with best practices in the Q&A. Just to reinforce what Scott said, we have a team, a very team A, prepared to answer your questions on the moderating section. So any question you have, feel free to jump in and ask a question. Don't need to wait for the end of the session to ask questions. And also all the decks, everything here will be recorded. So no worry, if you missed something, you can check it later. So also, before we start, I'd like to highlight two other online tech talks we did this year. They are related to the subject. The first one is how you monitor and manage AWS costs. This is more like a demo session, so it's a longer one, but it's very hands-on. Show tools like Cost Explorer, budgets, how you can do a proper tagging at your organization. So that's highly recommended there. And also very, tied to the right sizing topic of today. Alex did a great presentation on the T3 burstable instance. If you don't know what burstable is and how this can help you, definitely recommend you to check it out. Great content, great information there. So the AWS Cloud Economics team, the team that I'm part of, we talked to several customers over the past years about how to, cost management, their resource, how do you cost manage on AWS. And after identify, the best practices in there, we came up with this framework, what we call the Cloud Financial Management or CFM framework. So this is a list of all the things that are working that high advanced customers are doing to track costs on AWS. So going very quickly to each one of the four pillars in there, the first one, it's all about visibility or cost awareness. So how do you create a proper tagging strategy in your company? How do you know metrics, not only cloud efficiency metrics, right coverage, right sizing opportunities, but also business value metrics, cost per user. So, but basically, how can you break the overall AWS bill into small pieces that make sense not only for you, but for the rest of the organization? So that's the view pillar. That's the first one, and normally where customers start on. The second pillar, it's cost optimization, what we're going to cover more on the topic today. So over the cost optimization pillar, we have all the levers you can pull up to optimize and reduce your bill. So we're talking there about right sizing, AWS pricing models. We're talking about how to avoid waste, how to do elasticity. Today, we're going to focus more on this pillar, specifically on the right sizing piece. But just to close the framework, also, after you have the proper reporting and visibility of your cost, after you know which levers you can pull to cut costs, it's also important to predict cost. So everything about forecasting and planning, that's what we cover on the third pillar. And that's a very important topic, not only for existing workloads, but also for new workloads, what you're planning to launch in the future. How can you combine that to make sure that you have a proper, predictability or proper forecasting for finance for the next, months and years. And finally, the last pillar, or the cloud financial operation, sometimes called FinOps, that's how you glue all this together. So how you create a team, should you have a team to do that? Should you rely on a third party to do that? What are the governance topics you should consider for your organization to make sure everything here is working smoothly? But let's go straight to the topic of today's call, which is right sizing. Erin, can you tell us a little bit about the naming convention of the EC2 product?
Oh, well, EC2 is one of the products that, I haven't talked to a customer, honestly, who doesn't use it. And one of the things that I think is really cool about the way it was built is that the naming convention of the individual instances is actually really illustrative of what they do. And so all it takes is a little bit of code breaking. So essentially it starts with the instance family, which, the C instance family. And we'll talk about sort of what these instances mean in a minute. But essentially you have the instance family followed by the generation. The higher the number, the higher the generation. So if you're wondering and you're teetering on the edge of whether or not you want to buy something that's older or newer, typically I would recommend buying newer just so that you can future-proof your workloads. And also there's oftentimes a cost benefit to it, or, a lot of new features that come into play. Also, the next step is the attribute. And so we'll talk about attributes in a second, but essentially these resources all have really unique attributes that are attached to them. And then finally, you have the instance size. And so what is the family? What is its generation? What does it do? And how big is it? Are all the questions that you can answer just from the name itself. All right, and then when I talked about sort of the attributes of some of these resources, you may notice that there's a ton of categories and capabilities and options that you can apply to your instances, and there's some amazing help that not just my team can provide, but also Arthur's team, in helping you curate which is exactly the best category and capability for your different workloads, and then we can also help you from there move up and down in the different families inside the families that we provide. And finally, with 200 plus options, it's really kind of hard to find something that's not perfect for what you're trying to use. And so just to let you know that there's a lot of flexibility here, but we can also help you hone in on the instance types that make the most sense for your business. Finally, so you actually are in control here. And so if you're looking at something that has a continuously fixed sort of workload structure, that will help you set your mind model for how you would like to move down the path of right sizing. And then also for these variable workloads, it also right sizing is tuned a lot of times to your utilization. So keep that in mind as you move through it. A lot of times I will recommend starting with something that has sort of fixed usage, and then before I move into something that's a little bit more variable across the boards to see if you move into a more predictable business pattern. And so, and then the last thing I wanted to share before we dive into the actual process of how to do this is remembering that over-provisioning your resources can be costly. And so this is just one amazing example of a case where Arthur actually went into one of our customers and cut their savings in half. And so right sizing is a really powerful tool that you can have in your toolkit for cost optimization. It's by no means the only tool, but it's actually the one muscle that we recommend flexing at the beginning of your cost management journey. So if you're like, okay, I heard all about the budgets and the RIs and all these different things that AWS provides, I would highly recommend scoping down and thinking about right sizing, because every one of you has resources and we can help you right size them. All right, so this brings us to our first poll. Passing this back to Scott Singletary in a minute, but how much do you think you can save if the compute resources at your company were right-sized? Just to sort of get the ideas flowing.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of results, different results here. Just in a minute, we're going to share.
Looks like the poll is closed for voting, so let's take a look.
Yeah. So what are you seeing here, Aaron?
Oh man, let's see. We have a hefty chunk of people. A third of you have never done any right sizing before. Aren't we glad that you tuned in today? Arthur can certainly help you.
Yeah, right session. Awesome. Okay, cool.
And then saw a couple more 50%, so maybe you're not as special as I thought you were.
So just before we get into the data, I would like to give you two quick tips in case you need to, in case you want to leave today with something very tactical to, start doing at your end. So two things that I learned, after talking to several customers about right sizing. Well, the first one is newer generations on AWS. They're normally cheaper and they are more performatic than the old generations, right? So a quick way to start evaluating for right sizing opportunities at your company, even before looking at data utilization, just check which kind of generations you're using. So for example, for some of the cases here, those are all on-demand prices for Virginia. You can see that for a C5 large, for example, it can be 19% cheaper than the C3 family. And also for the M5 large family, also can have 27% cheaper than the M3 instance. So always consider the newer generations. Not only they are more performatic, but they're also going to be cheaper, which makes me, what I learned is from an engineer perspective, you always need to do a lot of testing for right sizing. But if you're moving to a more performatic instance, maybe the chances of that recommendation to actually be applied are higher. So definitely start considering there. And also, again, about the T family, the burstable family. If you don't know about it, you never heard it, definitely check Alex Online Tech Talk that I mentioned in the beginning. Those instances, they're significantly cheaper than the regular ones. And if your workload does not require a continued high CPU usage, they can be a very cost-effective approach. So definitely consider the T family. If you haven't used it already, doesn't know what they are, definitely check it. I think it's a good way to start on the right sizing journey. The main over-provisioning causes today are related to, of course, timing. Everyone is busy. Everyone is trying to push to launch resources or migrate resources as fast as they can. So it's very common to say, you know what, let's get it up and running and we can check it later. The most important thing that later should arrive. I mean, there should have a mechanism at your company that after you have it running, that you can recheck the size of the resources. Otherwise, they will be over-provisioned and you're going to pay for that, right? The second, root cause is the missing telemetry. There are a lot of unknown data points. If you're launching a new workload, you may don't know, how much CPU and memory do you need, right? So, you're going to over-provision because you don't want to have any bad experience over what you're launching. But again, after you launch it and after you have the telemetry, it's very important to revisit it, the sizes that the instances selection that you did. And finally, the operational unknowns, right? So inside your company, who owns right sizing? Who should be performing the right sizing? It should be the engineers, should be the product owners. That sometimes I visit a lot of customers that they actually have the data, they know how to quantify how much money they can save on right sizing, but they sometimes struggle a little bit to execute because there is a lot of unknown structure ownership on your company. So those are the main root causes, and we're going to talk a little bit how we can address them. Okay, so going to the second poll here, what are the main challenges for the ones that are listening to us that try to do right sizing, even your company today or the company in the past? What kind of challenges and blockers do you experience when trying to do that?
All right, let's take a look over here. And for the 34% of you who haven't right-sized before, I think that you might learn a thing or two from some of our friends here.
Yeah, definitely. Results coming in.
Yeah, it looks like we have a pretty even split between a lack of the metrics or tooling required to identify the resources and execute accordingly, as well as a lack of ownership within the company. It's not immediately clear who should perform these actions or own them.
Interesting.
Yeah, it also looks like we're getting some interesting information here about lack of time. And
yeah, so time is a very common one as lack of tooling. I think those are the most common ones that I hear on the field today. Very, very interesting to see your results there.
Yeah, and then lack of knowledge as the last one, and hopefully for the 20% of you who voted for that one, we'll be able to help address that today. And as we mentioned earlier in the session, we do have sort of our expert team sneaking around in the Q&A. So if you have a question, please feel free to post it. We have all sorts of people who can help.
Awesome. So how you can build a consistent approach toward the right sizing. So let's talk a little bit about governance and the process around it. So the Rightsizing Playbook, so the way you normally approach that with customers is, so there are 5-6 steps that you need to perform to build this process at your company. First one is, of course, defining the ownership or the room, the right sizing ownership model. Who should own each, not only the entire right sizing process, but each one of the steps, who should be responsible for the telemetry? Who should be responsible for executing the right sizing? Who should be responsible to measure the outcome? Like, is it saving money for us or no, right? The second one it's the telemetry part. So which kind of data do you need to identify underutilized resources? For some companies, they want very granular data. They want to check all possible CPU, memory, disk, network. Others, they're just happy with CPU. So where do you sit? How much data? What kind of data do you need to act? And this data is already available to you. Do you need to install something? How you can prepare the data to act on the right sizing? Finally, you need to, not finally, but the step 3 is you need to quantify the potential savings or the potential ROI, the return of investment, to make a decision if you should pursue that right sizing opportunity or not. Maybe you have a bunch of small instances, T2 nanos, T2 micros. They are underutilized, but they are so small, they are so cheap that maybe doesn't justify the time of your engineers, your time to pursue those right sizing recommendations. So you need to quantify in the beginning how much do you expect to save. And I know this is step, if you're doing this for the first time, this step can be a little challenging because you're doing this for the first time, you don't know how much time, how many hours from engineers you need to perform the right sizing. So in the beginning, it may be a little fluffy in there, but as you move along with this process, as you do this more and more time, that quantification will be a more realistic representation over how much money you can save, right? Step 5 talks about how you can prepare to execute the right sizing. So basically, who is going to perform? So we see on the market today 3 main flavors of ways of doing that. You have a centralized approach, a decentralized approach, and a hybrid one. I'm going to talk about them in a bit, but it's basically step 5, how you execute the right sizing. And finally, you're going to validate on step 6 the ROI. So you're going to see what you saw in step 3, how much you thought you're going to save, and then you're going to see how much you actually save it, right? And again, as you move along the process, that process will become more and more accurate, and exactly, that's so the last step, the green circle there, that's where you're going to start, involving more stakeholders and showing, celebrating wins and starting to, should this be a metric? Should this be a goal for everyone or not? So let's go deep into each one of the steps real quickly. So the step 1, defining the ownership. Again, this is where you start. This is very important. You need to do this once. After you define that, most times you don't need to keep updating it. But that's where you're going to put names or area teams, responsible for the activities, right? So who should be the one, defining the telemetry that's going to be used? What is an instance that requires downsize for you? It's something that never passed at 40% CPU. It's something that never passed at 20%. How aggressive do you want to be there? Also, who is going to install the telemetry? Like CloudWatch already delivers this information for you. So each 5 minutes, you already have on CloudWatch CPU information, network information. If you want to expand that to include memory, you need to install the plugins. And that's a custom metric. There is an additional cost around it. So who is going to act on this? Who is going to actually install? If you need memory to make a decision, who is going to do that? Right? And after you identify the underutilized resources, who is going to be the responsible of preparing what we call the run book, which is the plan for right size? Who is going to be the owner? So it's a very PM-like approach. That's a very important first step.
And I think that the thing that I've taken away from my conversations with customers, just like you, during these processes, is that the hardest part is deciding who needs to be in the room. Right? And so usually we find that customers are the most successful when they assemble a team of multidisciplinary stakeholders across DevOps. If you can get a finance or accounting person involved, that's also shown to be more successful. And then also think about the people in your organization that you think have a connection to sort of cost management, people who are really looking for ways to dive deep into really specific areas of your business and optimize them, not just for cost, but also for operational excellence. And that creates a really beautiful mind model where you get a lot of people in the room who have a good awareness of the business and of the goals and of the technology. And from there, writing a right-sizing plan and run book that incorporates everyone's unique viewpoints.
No, yeah, well said. I mean, finance perspective here is very important because they're the ones that can help you, measure the financial impacts for the company, help if you want to promote that inside your company, how you can get more stakeholders, more people supporting this activity. And also from an engineer perspective, I personally see cost as an additional efficiency metric that you need to take care, just like uptime. But if you're not convinced, if you think you should be just building architecture and deploying and not care about cost, that's also a way that you'll be invited to this journey. And basically in the future come up with a metric or something that can measure the success you have on how well sized your resources are.
And then one thing I should mention before we dive in is that one of the times that we found is most helpful is a lot of times companies have regular sync-ups about resource monitoring and the different benchmarks. It's really helpful to infuse cost into those existing meetings just as an organic construct, almost just like it's security or one of the other things that you consider as part of your overall journey. Yeah. So just in case you're wondering sort of like, this sounds great, but how do I embed it? Use your existing meetings. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Cost is a seamless way to just add an additional layer of intelligence on top of your resources.
Awesome. So for step 2 on the metrics part, when we talk about compute resources here, there are mainly 4 sets of metrics: CPU, network, memory, and disk. As I said, those metrics you can find them in CloudWatch, except for memory. Memory, it's a confidential information, so AWS will not collect you unless you allow it to, and then that requires you to install plugins, additional steps there, so CloudWatch can see and start tracking this information. Another important angle on the telemetry discussion is how are you going to consume this data? It's going to be on a maximum, minimum, and average. Imagine that you have information from the last month or the last 2 weeks, for example. That's a lot of data because you have for each 5 minutes, how much CPU, memory, network, and disk, for example, were utilized. How are you going to consume and make this actionable for you, right? So how you establish the thresholds, what is idle, meaning what should be turned off, right? What can be downsized to a smaller instance. So how do you establish that? So the metrics here, it's important discussion in terms of not only, I think in terms of the variables, I don't see them varying too much between customers, again, because those are pretty key elements there. But I see a lot of analysis, paralysis in there. So if you're doing this for the first time, try to get what you have as the default on the platform and try to see if that's enough for you to act. The worst thing that can happen are false positives, meaning an instance that was flagged as an opportunity to right size, and you go and investigate, and it's not. It's supposed to be working that way, right? So try to, in the beginning, try to at least test this relationship between, finance, engineer, whoever is owning the cost management piece at your company. Try to prototype this as much as you can, instead of trying to get the best, possible information in the first step. Because sometimes you can spend a lot of time in there, and even if you get that information, if you don't have those relationships established, you can fall into the same roadblocks, and that means more and more time to get an outcome of right sizing. So yeah, that's the key thing. Define the telemetry there. Try not to be super, demanding on your first try. And that over there, you can see on the table an example of the data you can get from CloudWatch, outlining some of this information. You also have a bunch of third-party tools in the market that can, combine this data and give this to you in a way that you think it's better. Tagging. Aaron's going to talk about the tooling later, but this is just an example of how you can, concisely get this information. For step 3, again, quantify the potential savings you can have and also make a decision should you pursue the right sizing recommendation or not. So basically there, you're trying to say, calculate how much savings you can get. Savings there means you have an instance, a large instance today, and you're considering changing this to a medium instance, a smaller, half of the size. How much savings can you get, right? And try to, of course, promote that to the future, maybe 1 year ahead, 6 months ahead, right? So that's the potential savings you can do it, right? And also, you need to invest time on the B part, which is estimate the right sizing cost. So the right sizing cost is if you have a tooling, for example, doing the right size analysis for you, you can put the cost of the tooling in there. How much time do you think engineers will need to execute on the right sizing? How much time are you investing on planning this? So this is where you see if it makes sense to you or not. So B should be smaller than A, right? If B is bigger and the same, close to A, that means that you're going to invest a lot of time in there, and the outcome, at least from a financial perspective, will not going to be, significant. So that's where you're going to, filter out the recommendations, the ones you should pursue for the ones that you should not. Also, that's a good way to prioritize. Maybe you should invest time on the ones that are the bigger ones, the bigger instance, the bigger savings first. So step 4, going to the execution of the right sizing. Again, if you're doing this for the first time, try to start it small, just try to get some confidence there. Start, for example, with dev environments, non-critical environments, instances that are maybe moving between the same family, because that means that you need to maybe skip some functional tests. a lot of the success of the right sizing, it relates to testing. You need to test the new instance before you're actually doing the switch, right? So if you're changing, an instance between families, but they have the same size, the same amount of CPU, the same amount of, memory, maybe an amount of testing you need to do there is different than if you're doing a more drastic change, like moving from a T family that has a smaller, different family, different behavior on the burstable part. So that's some of the angles you need to analyze when executing and building the plan for the right sizing. Also, so going to the ways of doing that, and again, we see in the market normally three setups on the companies on how they're performing right sizing. So the first one is what we call the centralized ownership model. So in this model, you have a single individual or a single organization performing all these steps by themselves. So they analyze which resources are underutilized. They determine which targets, which ones they should be doing based on the ROI measure step that we just talked. And they receive the go-ahead from the resource owners so they can perform the right sizing. Okay, so they are going to own the process end to end. They will create the runbook, which is the list of instances that should be right-sized, define owners, timings around that. They will execute it, and they will validate the ROI later. And then, so this is a centralized model. And as an example, this is a runbook example that, what you can use. So resource ID there, which team is it, who is the responsible, if it's completed, if it's not completed. Okay, so that's just an example. It's the centralized ownership. It's a model that I see working with some companies, but that requires a more technical team. So if you're building this at your organization, if you have engineers, people that are interested on this topic, that's definitely a way to go, right? The decentralized model, it's a model that's very popular when customers or organizations are trying to build the cost is everyone's responsibility message. So in that model, you have each one of the pods or each one of the squads, whatever how you structure in your company, each product owner will be responsible for their own right sizing activities, right? And the steps is they will be responsible for analyzing and identify right sizing opportunities, determining which ones you're going to pursue, executing, validating. So they're going to do end to end on the resource ownership, so on the product owner perspective. So that works when you have global metrics. So if you have finance or a high stakeholder in the company defining global targets for all product teams or for all dev teams regarding a metric related to right sizing, you can cascade down the logic for this metric and everyone will act on them. So if you have this kind of uncentralized organization, everyone is acting end to end on the workloads. They have full ownership there. That's a way that works, but again, they need to have a motivation to do that. Because even if you're delivering to each one of the resource owners very tactical information, how to right size, if they don't have any motivation to do that, that will just sit on everyone's email because everyone is busy, everyone's trying to do a lot of things. So that's, very popular way of doing it, but that has, a requirement of having proper, metrics beforehand.
Oh, for sure. And we oftentimes see that when the engineering lead is the resource owner here, we get a lot of traction in terms of seeing change occur and right sizing happen. And a lot of times we'll dovetail that in with instances that they're trying to deprecate based on an existing project, things like that. So the more integrated you can make it into these resource owners' lives, the more successful you will likely be. But yeah, that's all I had to say about this one. The decentralized ownership model is super interesting too because we're seeing a shift from sort of this centralized model actually to the decentralized model where individual business units are performing their own right sizing. And that's a shift that we hadn't seen up until a couple years ago, which I find really interesting. Yeah. And a lot of you that are starting out, maybe you're going to start in the centralized model, but it might be helpful to think a little bit down the line to say, hey, maybe in the future I don't need to do all this work myself.
Yeah, agree? Yeah. Divide and conquer. Yes,
exactly.
And another angle of this, it's the hybrid one, which maybe is a transition between, the centralized to the decentralized model. Not that the one is better than the other. I mean, what's the best one is what works for your company, right? But this one, where you have a single individual or organization doing all the analysis, looking for right sizing recommendations, determine, the targets or, which recommendations you will pursue, and then they distribute that to the resource owners, the product owners. And the product owners will be the one responsible for looking at this list, acting, approving or disapproving the ones that should be, should not be right-sized because of a justification that should be, defined on the ownership model on step one, and executing the right sizing. And then after this is executed, this individual company, this organization, so the single individual organization will come back and validate the ROI. So that's a very smooth model because you can leverage, the financial and the analytics potential on the first steps, step 1, 2, and 6, and you can leverage the technical skills on actually performing, automating, and doing the right size. So that's a very good process, a way of tackling this as well. However, that requires a lot of collaboration. So also maybe, don't be too hard on yourself if you're doing this for the first time, second time, that may be some, problems doing this interaction. But as you go move along, if you do this on a consistent way, that will become more and more fluid.
Yes, and if I had any words of wisdom that I wish I had taken into account when I first started on this topic, start small and methodical. Know what metrics you're shooting for, know the benchmarks, and then wrap it up with a pretty bow and share. Because people in your organization have all sorts of really amazing ideas, and they can help you grow it from there. And so the hybrid model, I think, is what we all in our heads are shooting for, but we know that your organizational reality varies. So whatever works for you.
Awesome. And finally, for step 5, so we have step 5 and 6 now, just to conclude this part of the webinar, but you need to validate the ROI. So after, the actual savings were the one that you calculated before, right? So how much savings you expected to get. And then on step 5, you're going to see, okay, how much time do we really invest? How much time the engineers really invested for this? How many, did we manage to reduce the instance to the size that I was recommending? Do I need to use another instance that is a little bit more expensive, but is still cheaper than the other one? So that's where you're going to get the real savings, and you're going to learn and say, okay, is this worth it or not? Right? So very, very important step there. And finally, the automation piece, which is after you do this for a while, there are some steps that can be automated, and that will give you more agility on performing this process, right? So, for example, you can link the savings, the expected savings, with the AWS pricing API list. That way, you don't need to be, for each instance you're trying to right size, you don't need to be looking at the prices in there, right? Also, for the telemetry piece, if you already define which kind of metrics do you need to define an instance to be right sized or not, how about making sure that all new resources already have this telemetry ready, so you don't need to come back and reinstall this again? Also, that comes on how you're deploying on AWS, in infrastructure by code. Are you letting people deploy by themselves? So this is all, there are some automation pieces, some efficiency parts of the process that you can start to put in there. So now, Erin, can you tell us a little bit about which tools AWS offers today to help this journey make more tangible?
Sure. Well, it's a loaded question, right? I guess for me, my question to you would be, for those of you who already right size, do you have a third-party tool that you use? And for those of you who are newer to the process, we at AWS do provide some degree of support for you to get started on your cost management journey, but it's by no means exhaustive. We have a lot of amazing partners in the marketplace who can help you dive incredibly deep into your data and provide really precise tooling on top of it. And so one of the things I was just curious about is sort of how familiar are you with our AWS native tools so that I can make sure that I tune sort of my talking track accordingly. All right.
Interesting results. So
yeah, very split on this one. This might be our controversial question of the day. It looks like we have a number of customers evaluating third-party solutions. We also have about a quarter who are using a third-party tool and are having a great experience with it. Like I said, AWS has this incredible partner system that we try to work with on a very regular basis because it matters to us that you're getting the information in the way that you need it. The other thing that's coming through here that's super interesting is that we have about 15% of you who are not considering any of the existing solutions. So maybe you can bear with me as we walk through some of the stuff that AWS offers out of the box, and you can see if it's a fit for what you need. So one of the best ways to get started with managing your costs on AWS is to use the AWS Cost Management product suite. This product suite is comprised of AWS Cost Explorer, our EC2 right-sizing recommendations that we'll dive into in detail in a minute, our RI reports and recommendations, not to mention things that we mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation around AWS budgets that can help you plan and receive alerts if your costs are not trending towards what you expected. In the last 12 months, we have worked diligently to add additional features to Cost Explorer, of which resource optimization recommendations are one of them. And Cost Explorer allows you to access comprehensive dashboards that give you a view of your key cost and usage information, as well as the ability to view trends that automatically scan your costs and usage and identify potential spikes to you. So we provide sort of broad coverage of sort of your trending information, as well as high-level information that can help you identify areas for cost optimization. We heard back from a lot of you that what you really wanted was a more optimized user experience, so we've worked to do that, and also more predictability. How do you plan ahead for your future spending before you delve into your overall cost optimization processes? And so what we tried to do was refine the forecasting algorithm so that it more closely matched your business. And so anytime you're doing any sort of forecasting within AWS, I would highly recommend looking at AWS Cost Explorer to do so. And then also, we wanted to contextualize AWS Cost Explorer with additional information like recommendations to help you make smarter decisions from the get-go. As we all know, time is a premium for a lot of you, and so what we were trying to do is create a getting started experience for you that's a jump-off point where you can decide where do you want to invest next in your cost optimization journey. As I mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of functionality that you can access within this console, and today we're going to focus specifically on sort of resource optimization. Resource optimization recommendations were launched in July of this year, and we provide the ability for you to gain EC2 instance-based recommendations. From there, we actually provide a unified view across your payer account. If you want to see every single instance that's recommended for optimization, we also offer this, if you so enable it, at the payer account level, at the linked account level, where you will see only the resources that you yourself utilize and own. And so just keep in mind that this is something that can be done centrally, of course, from the payer account, but also on an individual linked account by linked account basis. The idea here, as you can see from the screenshot, is actually to bubble up the instances that are underutilized or are perhaps idle, and allow you to see it from a single level view where you can either download a CSV and share with your stakeholders or take action immediately from the console. So from there, there's a couple other things that I wanted to mention, which is that we are able to quantify your potential savings, but keep in mind that if you're operating on your own, you may want to download the CSV. I know that Arthur always does. There's always custom things that he wants to do, and so keep in mind that this is a really great starting point, and we can dive very directly into it right now, actually.
Let's go with a quick demo here.
Yeah, and so let's hope that our session hasn't expired. So at this point, a lot of you are probably familiar with the Billing and Cost Management Dashboard. As you know, you can access it through here in the My Billing Dashboard link, or you can search for it on the AWS console. You can also pin Cost Explorer here if you want to get back to it really quickly. But essentially, you can actually just click on Cost Explorer. Just to make it easier, we clicked on it for you ahead of time. This is the dashboard that I walked you through a second ago, where you're able to view your costs at a high level, along with any trends that we may have highlighted before diving extremely deep into your recommendations. At this time, we provide two separate classes of recommendations here. The first one being the resource optimization recommendations for EC2 that we will discuss in detail, as well as the ability to purchase ORIs. It's worth mentioning that this spans all the reservation models offered by AWS, RDS, EC2, Elasticsearch, ElasticCache, Redshift, you name it. And so for now, I'm going to click the View All link to show you the actual recommendations.
And by the way, if you don't see that view part on your console, if you're trying to replicate at home later, you need to enable that first.
Oh, yes. One of the things that a lot of customers don't know about is actually the settings button, which is in the top right corner. And essentially, there's all sorts of different degrees of information that you can allow your linked accounts if you're a payer account. The other thing that this will help you know is what you might be able to see should you ask your payer account for information. So knowledge is power. But essentially, right now, we have this ability to go here and see all the recommendations. There's some light filtering capabilities. As you can see, this is one of our smaller test accounts, and so our estimated savings are pretty high in terms of percentage, but essentially in terms of actual dollars, it's not the highest. So keep in mind that this is another way of balancing your ROI just right off the bat. I typically recommend that you take a look at your idle instances and then go, like, this is a really good starting point to say, is this really idle? And either look into the instance yourself or to reach out to the person who owns it. From there, once you've sort of taken a look at all of your idle instances, I would then recommend diving into your underutilized instances, perhaps for a particular linked account, region, or cost allocation tag, and refining from there. So like I said, methodical, deciding what is the discrete chunk of your business that you would like to right size, and then you can very easily dive into a particular recommendation. One recommendation here allows you to view all of the details about the particular resource, as well as any tags that are applied. You can also view the resource details of how it's operating and its usage. You'll notice that disk and memory are not populated here. If you would like to do so, as Arthur mentioned earlier, those are considered private metrics, and so you can enable an AWS CloudWatch agent to actually collect that data, and it'll integrate it right here for you as well. The other thing that I should mention is that if you own any reserved instances, this information is automatically calibrated under the hood so that you will not experience a decline in your RI coverage. The other thing I should mention is that you'll notice that you have not one, not two, but three recommended options here. Essentially what we're trying to do is modify or take the instance that you're looking at, which in this case is a T2 extra large. Based on your utilization right now, which you saw, it may make sense to move it down to a T2 large, but we also provided the ability to see sort of what a T2 nano and a T2 micro might look like for this exact instance. So that's all I wanted to show you here, besides the fact that you can go to the EC2 console anytime and locate the individual instance and dive deeper to learn more about it.
Yeah, it's interesting on this example that I know it's a testing account, but if you see more than half, or at least a little close to the half of the saving comes from the idle instance. And the reason for that is because for the idle check, we are actually recommending you to turn off the instance, right? So you also need to maybe, so coming back to the whole, right-sizing playbook, maybe that instance needs to be on, and you're going to downsize, so the overall savings will be a little bit less than what you previously expected. But as Erin says, I definitely recommend you guys to start with the idle ones, because it's an easier conversation, right? Like for this case here, this is less than 1% of CPU usage over the last 14 days, right?
And this is one of my test accounts. I'll admit that this was a miss. I found this yesterday and haven't had time to kill it, but maybe it's good for demo purposes. Yeah. But essentially, one of the other things that I should mention is that if you're looking into the details, which it looks like from the chat, some of you are pretty detail-oriented people, I should mention that we look at all of your instances over the last 14 days, and based on your maximum CPU utilization over that time period, that's when we bubble up the recommendation. So keep in mind that we're operating off of a max CPU model, but I've seen cases, especially for some of our more enterprise-focused customers, where they create these, they download this CSV, the one that you're essentially looking at here, and they create scores that combine not just CPU and network capacity, but also the memory and disk numbers. And so all these sort of compound scores can be really beneficial to your business as you grow and scale. And this is a really good point of departure for that.
And there is also an API available, right, for customers that want to automate that?
Oh, certainly. The AWS Cost Explorer API provides you comprehensive access to the underlying data set under AWS Cost Explorer, and it's tuned for your ad hoc querying as well. So if you're an API-friendly person, definitely recommend looking into the Cost Explorer API. It's a quick win in terms of automation.
Cool. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Thanks for the demo. Yeah, very, very useful information. This is an example of the output, of course. So if you download that CSV, that's the kind of data you have in there. I've erased it for the example. You also have the tags, as Erin showed. So on this output, I've killed those columns, but of course you have tags as well in there to better understand where you should, which teams you should pursue. You can see the recommended action here, terminate or modify. That will also depend on the resource optimization logic. For the ones that want more details, this slide shows a quick summary. Takes the last 14 days. It already, as Erin said, already combines, already takes into consideration your RI usage, so you don't need to worry about, downsizing an instance that is covered by an RI and lose the RI utilization there. It's already considered on the recommendations. We're already filtering this out for you. We have two main types of recommendations on there, right, Erin? One is a terminate for idle and downsize for the underutilized instances, right? And the idle ones are basically the ones that are below 1% CPU, so that's where automatically considered to turn off. At least that's the default recommendation for AWS. You need to always test and validate that before applying this.
Yes, please do.
Yeah.
But essentially, these defaults were actually built based on conversations with a lot of those of you out there that have started on your resource right-sizing journey. Yeah. And so keep in mind that these might not be the numbers that are most tuned to your business, but it could be a good place to start.
Yeah, agree. Yeah. And for the downsize, anything that is between 1 and 40% CPU usage will be flagged as a downsize opportunity. Again, this is CPU. If you want to include memory in there, you can with the Cloud agent. There is an additional cost in there, but that will give you more information. Again, avoids the number of false positives, and that will also take into consideration on this logic, right? That's it. I think, again, we have three types of...
And last but not least, it's completely free.
Oh, yeah, that's very important.
We should mention that. It's one of those things where resource optimization, it's not just right-sizing your resources to save costs, it's making sure that you're using the right resources. And so what we wanted to do is make sure that you had a platform where you could quickly and easily make changes that move the needle, not just on your costs, but how your business is operating in terms of efficiency and operational excellence. And so keep in mind that there is a small charge included with installing the CloudWatch agent, but sort of the base offering without that is completely free.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. I mean, it's if you haven't enable it now and wait, gives I think 24 hours, right, until you can get the first recommendations, right?
Yeah, but I enabled the account yesterday and it showed up in 5 minutes. So I don't know what the actual service level guideline is, but I've been impressed by the fact that it just shows up whenever I need it. Ooh. So you might want to do that right now, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that for those of you who are reserved instance customers, it would be remiss of me not to mention AWS Cost Explorer has added, I think, something in the realm of 15 to 20 new features specific to managing your RIs in the last year. And so it's one of those things where if you're looking for sort of your next step, once you get your resource right-sizing under control, I would maybe recommend thinking about how you could optimize the RIs that you currently have as well. All the learnings that you applied from this, incorporating into your existing workflows, making sure the right people are in the room, you can really just start dovetailing additional topics in there. And RIs might be one of them. Storage optimization is something that's a whole other webinar, but it's something that we could talk about at length. There's a lot of different places to go, but right-sizing your individual resources is often a good bet.
No, definitely. I mean, as a trigger, after you right-size your environment, definitely consider RIs are definitely a way to still, even more maximize the savings you can get on the platform. Mm-hmm. So let's wrap up with best practices and wait for some Q&A, right? So based on my observations, cloud economics, I think Erin's observation will be, aligned with this as well. Talking to customers on the field, recommendations to start doing this in your company, or if you're already doing this and want to, be better at it. I think just, start simple. Again, idle resources, non-critical environments, old generations. Again, the amount of testing you need to do and the outcome there, it's the highest chances of success. So start there. Don't start with the more complex, databases you're running in there. I mean, go to the easy, low-hanging fruits first. Launch time can be an interesting variable. Like if you have a very old instance that was launched, years ago, check there first. Like that's a good way to, if you haven't enabled resource optimization yet, that's a good way to start looking, mapping possible candidates for right sizing. If you have instances in there on the resource optimization, for example, they're part of the same outscaling group or the same tagging structure, that's also a good indicator that maybe you test one and you can right-size several instances as a single action. So that's also a good way to maximize the return. If you're doing for one instance inside the outscaling, maybe you can do for all the instances in there as well. A lot of customers ask me, should I do this every month? Should I do this, once, twice a year? That really depends on how much this is important for your company, how much you're spending on AWS today as well. So there are the trade-offs. Discuss with your organization the trade-offs of doing this continuously or schedule over the year or quarterly basis. Again, this is an activity that requires the collaboration a lot of areas in the company. So make sure you have everyone buy in to do that. Testing a lot. I mean, we saw more than 200 instances available on AWS today. So make sure that you're testing those instances and to make sure that the right sizing recommendations are aligned to your workload. And what I tell to customers sometimes is if you manage to test, you see that you can right size, but for some reason you don't have any time to do that. It's a production workload. You don't want to impact the user uptime data on there. At least apply this learning for new workloads. If you know that the M4 large instances, for example, that you're running are above over-provisioned, every time you see another one or every time that team is launching a new instance, try to apply those learnings because the best right sizing is the one that you do on the moment zero, like before launching the resource. Of course, if you don't have time before Agile, you want to launch because you need to meet, you don't know how much your product will be using. You may be okay of over provisioning in the beginning, but the best way is actually to right size in the beginning. So make sure you're applying those learnings. And finally, as Aaron said on the reserved instance piece, if you wanted to buy Arise now, you have an Arise strategy. Just make sure that if you're buying standard Arise, you need to purchase after you do the right sizing, right? Because you're less flexible. But if you can add, if you want to move fast with the savings, you want to move with Arise right now, but you don't want to lose the money with the right sizing, make sure you're buying convertible Arise so you can maybe convert them accordingly to the instance that you right size. So I think those are the main best practices that I hear. I don't know, Erin, is there something you want to highlight here?
I think that going back to the first bullet point, start simple. There's so much that you can do, and I mean, we're in a world where resources outnumber people, right? And so making sure that you have the right people in the room can really help you to quickly and surgically cut costs in a way that is really impactful for your business. And if I had $1 for every time someone presented me with an Excel spreadsheet that they said got them promoted of their right sizing, I would probably have their bonus. Yeah, it's been a lot. It's been more recently, so I'm looking forward to hearing back from you guys about the journey that you yourselves are taking.
So
yeah, let's get you started. We have a number of resources here at AWS that you can use to really dive deep or zoom out, whatever level of detail that you need to get started. Keep in mind that I'm happy to circle back with you, accept blog topics for our blog. There's a lot of different work that we do, but a lot of times collaboration is key. And that's not just collaboration within your company, but also with maybe people in your communities, with your TAM, with support. There's a lot of people who are invested in helping you get started with resource right sizing because it just helps you be more operationally efficient. And then last but not least, after listening to us, do you plan to right size your resources after tuning into this session? We would love to know. Or are you asleep? In which case, I am very sorry.
Looks like the majority of people are going to consider right sizing. So great, yeah.
Well, awesome. I guess you and I have done our job for the day. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. Yeah. We're looking forward to hearing your questions. And without any further ado, I'm passing this back over to Scott Singletary.